Hello, this is Jason Steinbach, and today we're going to go over driven pile relaxation in Florida sandy soils. We're going to look at the causes of relaxation, the impacts that it has on pile foundations, and some design considerations. All right, so the major topics that we're going to have to cover is going to be driven piles, what they are, what is driven pile relaxation, some of the research that we've done here at USF, and the results of that research, and then how to use this design aid that we have developed to help mitigate the effects of pile relaxation. All right, first let's talk about what a driven pile is. So what are driven piles? Driven piles are long, slender elements, typically made out of concrete, steel, or timber, and they have a very long length to a very small base, and they help support larger structural elements. In this case here, we're looking at some square precast concrete piles that were driven at the Howard Franklin Bridge. We typically, in the state of Florida, we use precast concrete piles for its ability to help resist corrosive forces. There's a cover surrounding the steel rebar, which is going to be the primary failure mechanism in a driven pile when exposed to high moments, if the corrosion. We don't normally use steel, and we don't normally use timber because steel corrodes, and timber just does not have the same capacities as the other two materials. These piles are driven into the ground using a large hammer, as seen here. Uh, Basically, an explosion happens, it launches the hammer up, and then it falls back down and it hits the pile. And we're able to go and measure a lot of these hits using something called PDA, or a pile driving analyzer. A pile driving analyzer is very useful in verifying the capacity, which we're going to just discuss in a second. Okay, now that we know what a driven pile is, how do we get the design capacity? There are two main components to capacity for a driven pile. That is the skin friction of a pile and the end bearing capacity of the pile. Skin friction is developed through friction in sand and cohesion in clays, and is the soil resisting the driving of the pile any further into the ground. The end bearing capacity is provided just by same force as just at the bottom of the pile, and provides a pretty substantial component of the pile strength. In order to determine how the resistances on the pile are generated and how it gains its capacity, we need to know some stuff about the soil it's going to interact in. This will allow us to determine, hey, if we drive it this far, we expect this much resistance, and it makes sure that we're not just putting 100, 200, 300-foot piles in for no reason. So in order to do this, we use the standard penetration test. SPT testing is a very complicated process of just hitting a rod into the ground with a hammer of a known weight. Yeah, it's pretty basic, but the end result is that we're able to get a relative strength of the pile of the soil and determine, hey, what soil layers are dense, which ones are not, which ones are loose, and which ones are compact, depending upon if it's a sand or a clay. With our boring log, we can input all of our information into SPT 97 and then determine what sort of testing we want to get at the end. That's where these phi factors here come into play, in which we're going to help determine how confident we are that we're going to have the proper resistance. So there's two types of methods that we can use to verify a pile's capacity. The first one is being a static test. If you just use a standard penetration test or just a cone penetration test, which is very hard to do at deeper depths, you can get a phi factor of about 0.3 to 0.45. In this case, we're not looking at the pile and we're not performing a PDA analysis on it. Now, when we go to dynamic formulas and the dynamic methods of verifying pile capacity, it gets a little more interesting. So we can use PDA. We can look at the dynamics and how the waves propagate through the pile to determine its resistance. And if we do some further analysis with the CapWAP, we're able to get a nice reduction or a nice strength reduction factor of 0.65 instead of the 0.3 or 0.45 of the other methods. By going a little further, we can also do a higher amount of PDA to get, if we do all of it on PDA, we get a 0.75 phi factor. And if we have static load testing, we get the same. And if we combine the two, we get 0.8. So it increases our confidence the more testing that we perform on the pile. So now, why do we always use PDA? Or not always, but use it a lot. And that's because of two main reasons. One, It is extremely economical compared to other testing methods, and it gives a very good return on that investment. We already had to do SPT testing and all that to get an idea of how far to drive the pile because we don't want to have our contractor install a 300-foot pile when most of it's going to get cut off. But it's also not as expensive as having to do other forms of testing like a static load test where you have to bring in all of the material to load the pile to failure. The other thing is it's very easy to perform. We already have to drive this pile into the ground, and PDA takes maximum advantage of that, as you're recording data every single time the hammer hits. From that, we get a good idea of our capacity at a relatively cheap cost. All right, so we'll go ahead and perform some PDA analysis. So right here, this is the end of an initial drive. This log here gives us all the information of the pile driving analyzer, and it tells us our capacity of the pile along with several other things. So first thing we'll look at is the blow count. For now, we'll just take a look at it and say, hey, it exists. It's very good to know how many times the hammer hit the pile, and it can help diagnose issues further down the line. But some of the more important metrics are the blow count metric, which is the amount of blows it took to advance the pile a single foot. This is real-time feedback on the resistance of the pile in the ground without doing the wave analysis. But we'll go to do the wave analysis in a little bit. Then we have the CSB value. This is the end bearing capacity at the end of the pile. By knowing how much how much the stress is at the bottom of the pile, we're able to determine the end bearing capacity of the pile. And we can back calculate the skin friction when we combine it with the RMX value. Now the RMX value over here on the right hand side, that is the capacity of the pile, the total capacity. This is what we are ultimately looking at to determine whether we have relaxation or not. And it's very important to note that the RMX capacity can vary a bit. It's highly dependent on your case dampening factor, which is why you have to perform a CAPWAP analysis to verify that you're using the right value. RMX will automatically select the best one, but there's a few other time values you might get on a log like an RX7, which is the 0.7 case dampening factor, when in other times you might have like an RX4, which would be a 0.4. RMX automatically sets it to the best value. We also have the energy of the pile measured with the EMX, or energy of the hammer. This is to ensure that we have enough energy in the hammer to develop the forces so that when we compare them later on, they're nice and strong. Because when you come here, this is the set check file. Now you see how there's also the same values here recorded. We have our blow counts, we have our CSB, our RMX, but it's also important to look at our EMX, and this is what I mean by strong previously. If our EMX value here is much lower on this log, which occurs sometime after the initial drive, then we might not have an accurate representation of the pile's true capacity. We might not have put enough energy into it to determine the capacity. So this here is a log for a set check. So set checks, as I alluded to a little earlier, they are performed some point after. They're basically a way to verify and say, hey, we did it the first time. Now what's our capacity at a later point? We want to know that when we drove the pile in the first time that it wasn't just a fluke and something for some reason put a ton of support. So what we want to do here is we want to look at our RMX values, and we're going to eventually compare it to the other one. And this is where we're going to get to pile relaxation. In this case, the RMX on the previous slide was higher than the RMX on this slide. That indicates that we lost pile capacity, which is not good. And that is a prime example of driven pile relaxation, where the driven pile loses capacity. Even after time, it's just allowed to sit there and just do nothing. Now, relaxation isn't the only case. Relaxation occurs when we lose that capacity, which is very not good. But more commonly what's observed is something called setup, in which the pile actually gains strength. And this is very good to know also because we like when things gain strength. If we estimated 100-ton capacity and we're getting 120 tons out of it, I mean, that's a lot safer for the general public and for us. We have more confidence in our structure at that point. But that's only what we don't want to happen is relaxation, because let's say we had that same 100-ton pile and now suddenly it's at 80 tons. We lost 20 tons of capacity. That puts our structure at a lot greater risk. So that's why we want to try and quantify it and get some way to estimate the worst case of driven pile relaxation out there. So the first thing we need to know when looking at driven pile relaxation is how does it happen? We know that we don't want it, but there might be some easy explanations for why it occurs. So there's two primary methods of pile relaxation that we've observed. The first is concrete creep. The literature shows that it can be prevalent and typically it happens in younger piles. So what ends up happening is concrete, as it ages, it shrinks a little bit, and this decrease in length, it has to go somewhere. So it actually might create a void at the bottom of the pile. And an easy way to solve this sort of relaxation is you hit the pile a couple times after the creep's occurred to minimize the impact of the creep. Because after some time, concrete will slow down its shrinkage, and it basically becomes nothing. We don't have to worry about it. Now, the other mechanism is dilation. So during the driving process, all the soil particles get sheared, and they get pushed out of place. So it artificially increases the pile capacity, but as you let time exist, it falls back into a more natural state, which reduces the pile's capacity. And this is the biggest issue we have in terms of relaxation in the state, is that we have a lot of dense sands that they can shear pretty easily. So here we're going to look at and get a little bit better of an understanding of what dilation is, because it is one of the biggest issues we got. So as you drive your pile down, you have a compression zone that's very close to the tip. This is where everything's compacted even more than it was previously. But when we go a little further out, then we have this dilation zone. This dilation zone is where all the shearing is occurring and other forces are pushing the particles out of place, and it's not as compacted as it used to be. And then outside that range, we have another zone of compression at 2.5 times the diameter of the pile, and previously dilated sands also exist alongside the side of the pile, ones that were greatly affected by this dilation process. So now that we know the cause and what relaxation is, let's go into what the research that we've done here at USF and some of the results we've come to. So to boot, we need to know where we did this study. So this study is performed all across the state of Florida. Especially, we had a few areas of concentration up in Pensacola area, because there was a bridge up there that had a lot of cases of relaxation. Howard Franklin, which was close to us, that had a couple cases. So it was observed throughout the state. And the one common thing with all of these piles that we'll get to in a bit is the amount of sand that we're looking at. We're not really having issues in clays. And we still didn't even have many in limestone, but sand, dense sands were a big issue. So here is the end-bearing soils that we observed. So as you can see, most of these are grouped into as either uh, poorly graded sands or sands with silt. We have some silty sand cases and a few clayey sands, a little bit of limestone, and then we had one case that was observed in a clay. Although we did take a look at that boring log, and that one little clay sample is surrounded by sand on all sides. Um, so what we've looked at is that relaxation is based off of kind of the soil that the pile is tipped into. Typically, if you tip into a clay, you're not really going to observe relaxation. Um, it does not fully consider all of the soils that affect the skin friction on the side of the pile. It does consider it a bit, but if you hit into like a rock, like a limestone, you're not really going to get many observation cases. So it's typically going to be a sandy soil. One of the things that we wanted to look at to see if it had a big influence was the failure mechanism of these piles. Um, in this case, we found that there's not really a conclusive result on what's the primary failure mechanism, as we experienced both end bearing and side shear capacity failures. So here we have the CSB ratio, which is the set check value for the CSB divided by the end of the initial drive value for the CSB. And then we plotted it against the capacity ratio, which for the RMX ratio was the RMX from the set check divided by the end of the initial drive RMX value. And then the FDOT capacity, which, while included here, doesn't really have any scientific merit. It is just a method that the FDOT uses to rate the pile's capacity. So the ratios we mentioned before with the RMX and CSB, they can also be applied to the blow count per foot. So right here, we're going to take a look at what we are referring to as relative embedment. And what we're doing here is we're looking at that live real-time feedback to help determine what our level of embedment into a given soil layer is. So instead of us looking at what's traditionally looked at, which is the soil type and the soil stratums, instead we're going to look at, hey, what value is our blow count? So in this case, we're going to follow a pile tipped at an elevation of negative about 25, where the blow count was 56. So we just said, okay, any value that is 100% of that capacity that's above that pile, let's say that's embedment. We call that 100% relative embedment, which for here, it extends up a good few feet all the way to an elevation of negative 18.5. But we took this idea a little further. So we're like, okay, well, what if we had it slightly weaker than the tip blow count? And we're like, okay, what if it's 90%? Well, in this case, we go even a little further. We're now at an elevation of negative 17.5. So we are saying, okay, we're reducing our criteria a bit, and it's going to increase the embedment, the relative embedment of the tip and of the pile. And you can take this concept and you can keep going further and further. Here I also demonstrated the 50%. So if we take 50% of that 56, we can go all the way up to an elevation of negative 12.5, which would be our new relative embedment, all the way from that base of about 25 to all the way to about 12 and like 12-ish. So then what we did is we decided, okay, let's take all of our capacity ratios and let's take this new relative embedment, but we're going to take it and we're going to put it in terms of the D to B ratio, or the length of the pile divided by the base of the pile. And we're going to see how it changes as we go from a 20% blow count all the way up to 100% of the blow count. So here we have the data plotted for the 100 or 90. It's about the same. It doesn't really matter. And what we can do is we create this sort of envelope. And as you see, 90 and 100 are right on top of each other. 80, 70, everything else starts getting a little further away. But if this is our worst case relaxation here on this first line here, then we might be able to have a way to estimate our RMX capacity ratio of the F for what our set check will be in the worst case. As we remember, the set check is done afterwards, so If we take our initial value from the end of the initial drive and we multiply it by this ratio presented here, we are able to then predict our worst case pile relaxation occurrence observed in the setup. Check. All right, so from this we can create a design aid, which we're going to delve into here. So what we then decided to go back and do after we ran through the blow counts is, okay, what about if we did it for SPT? And what we found was it's very similar. You'll get almost the same exact failure envelope. So right here on the left we have our blow count method, and over here on the right we have the SPT tip data. And as you can see, they're very, very, very close. The SPT data is a little bit more spread out, but they still plot about the same. So what we decided on is, okay, what's the approximate line for this envelope? And we can get the RMX ratio of the worst case relaxation event. And that happened to be 0.4 times the length of the pile divided by the base of the pile plus 0.6. But this D to B is of the relative embedment. So it's not going to be the total length of the pile, it's going to be the length of the pile that's contributing to embedment. But it has to be 90% of the tip or 100% of the tip. So this is what a pile design process would look like going forward. So first we would acquire our Davidson capacity from the SPT testing, which could be done in SPT 97 or Florida Deep. Then we can go and calculate our relative embedments for all depths. And then we can get our multiplier from the formula or from the chart. Once we have this multiplier, we can multiply it by the Davidson capacity, and we can get our worst case relaxation occurrence. So we'll go through a similar procedure with our boring log in order to get our value. So instead of going through it on the output from our PDA analysis, instead what we'll do is we'll pull up the boring log from the project, and in this case I just picked an arbitrary value just to demonstrate how this would work. So we said, okay, so if we're tipped into this 50 layer here, and we have 100, need 100%, well, we don't even have that, and we don't even have 90. So we're going to have the worst case relaxation with a multiplier of 0.6 in both these cases. If we were tipped a little higher up, we might be able to get a little bit further, but it doesn't help much because we want to really know what is in the most immediate area and it going up. That's what we found tended to model best in terms of, hey, how do we predict relaxation? Now, if we really look at this 50% relative embedment up here, we didn't create a formula as we didn't find the envelope to be very effective, or not as effective at handling relaxation, but it would go all the way up to this 31 value here. Now, this is extremely valuable as we can then cap the length of our piles, which will make them cheaper and it will be more resource effective, like you allocating your resources better, and it's going to be more cost effective on bridges or buildings. So one of the things that we'd like to see is a development of a way to modify our software output to account for this. So this here is for a different bridge than the one we walked through. This is for Pensacola Bay Bridge, where we did a very in-depth analysis on. And we were able to calculate our worst case relaxation. We did it for the entire pile and compared that to the Davidson capacity. So over here on the chart on the left, you can see the dotted black, which is our relaxation, worst case relaxation capacity. And over on the right on the solid gray, this here is our expected Davidson capacity. And then you also see in circle, we had our relaxation occurrence, which was on the left, and our circled on the right is the capacity we got at the end of the initial drive. So it's fairly accurate. And depending upon how you want to do your analysis, you can get a lot of your pile capacity back. And you can ensure that the pile doesn't relax, or if it does, it still relaxes, but you have enough capacity that you're not in a state of failure. Over here on the right-hand side, we can see our relative embedment, which is the D to B. That there, our relative embedment's in orange, and then over on the right-hand side is our the value that we're using, our RMX ratio multiplier. So as you can see, it fluctuates back and forth just based off the length of the pile and the different blow counts that we encounter from our BLC value. But what's very nice is that we're then able to say, hey, even if we have a chance of relaxation over here at a depth of a little above 40 feet, we're still going to have enough capacity and we'll still be okay. So I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in and listening into Pile Relaxation. If anyone has any questions, I know that this presentation isn't live, it's recorded. You can always send me an email at jssteinbach@usf.edu, or if you're in the class, you can ask me about it in class. And here are the references that are relevant to this, like if you wanted to look into further readings. We have the AASHTO LRFD design specs. We have the publication that we're getting ready to have turned into DOT. We're just around the corner from turning that in. And then some other things relating to creep, the pile group effects and soil dilation, and some of the setup and relaxation in the glacial sands. A lot of these are of very good images, and they're also very good reads on pile relaxation and show a lot of what's out in the literature.